Hello, everybody. How are you? Well, welcome you all to another episode of uh, Storytime with Pittsburgh Flip. Not sure what that ding just was. Oh, I think it may have been over here on my monitor. Yeah, there we go. There we go. I've got it comments over here a little bit bigger so that I can see them. Although it's kind of hard to switch between reading and commenting. But you guys can make fun of me if you want. That's fine. Tonight, I've got a little bit something different. I'm combining my love of this book. The book is The Diamond in the Window, Jang Langton. We're on chapter 10, so if you missed, you might want to go back and look at the playlist to hear the other first 10 chapters or first 9 chapters. But tonight, I'm going to combine that with my love of chili. And I have here Psycho Chocolate Chili Salted Caramel, Naga Confectionery. It's by psychojuice.com. Says caramel milk chocolate with sea salt flakes, vanilla fudge pieces, and Naga Jolikia chili. Serious chocolate for serious chili heads. Hallowed be thy pain. So, showed you the packaging. A little bit of reflection there, but I think you can see that. Little skulls. Here's the front of the chocolate. I don't know if you can see it. It says, "Oh," which is probably the surprised sound that you make when you eat it. And on the back, you can see flakes of But Jolokia, or the ghost pepper, or the Jolokia Naga, which is in here. In here, there is caramel milk chocolate. Then it goes through and lists the ingredients for milk chocolate, which aren't as interesting. Vanilla fudge, milk, palm oil, butter, soy lecithin, sea salt flakes, chili flakes, and Naga Jolikia chili powder. And produced in the UK exclusively for Psycho Juice. So, it should be good. I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to open it up here very carefully. Break off a couple bits. Don't know how this is going to be me speaking, so we'll see. But chapter 10 is Disaster at Walden. You could see Uncle Freddie and the 2 children and the mantelpieces. Itadakimasu. Tasty. Disaster at Walden. Finding the doll from Little Women was a triumph, but it had brought them no closer to Ned and Nora. And the doll Johanna wasn't the kind of treasure that would help Aunt Lily. Eleanor and Edward studied the verses in Edward's notebook again. Said Eleanor, like this ruby here. If we could only figure out this verse, we'd have both diamonds and pearls, said Edward. He read it aloud. Living in his Eden, playing on his flute, Henry hoed his beans and wore an old suit. Find the third in Walden, find it, if you will. Pearls and coromandel, diamonds from Brazil. Do you suppose, said Eleanor thoughtfully, that the Henry in the poem is Uncle Freddy's Henry? Thoreau did live in Walden Woods. Or maybe it's some Henry in the Bible, said Edward. See, it talks about the Garden of Eden. Where's Coromandel? Said Eleanor. Some place in China? Hazarded Edward. Did Uncle Freddy's Henry play the flute? Said Eleanor. Eddie didn't know. Eleanor decided to ask Uncle Freddy. She found him in the parlor. He was washing Henry's face. Now, old fellow, said Uncle Freddy, just be patient while I scrub behind your ears. There, now, for a good wipe. Henry disappeared behind a huge Turkish towel, vigorously handled by Uncle Freddy, and emerged again looking clean and white. Eleanor looked at his calm marble face. Did he play the flute, Uncle Freddy? She said. Did he hoe beans? Did he wear an old suit? Who, Henry? Said Uncle Freddy. Of course he does. Another piece of chocolate. That settled it. For once they had figured out a clue cleverly and correctly. Eleanor and Edward went into an excited whispered conference. They agreed that Henry must have been a rich hermit who had buried diamonds and pearls under his cabin on the shore of Walden Pond. Perhaps they were still there. Hastily, they gathered shovels for digging and an old Gladstone bag to carry the jewels back home in. Aunt Lily wanted to know what they were up to. Just a hike down to Walden Pond, said Edward. The shovels had to be explained. Eleanor thought quickly. To collect rocks, she said. Then Uncle Freddy wanted to go too. I'll just pay a call on Henry, he said. Eleanor and Edward looked at each other in dismay. But Aunt Lily asked them to take him along. It will be a nice outing for him, poor dear, she said. They started off, an odd threesome, walking down the road. On the other side of the turnpike, they came upon some boys who had hitchhiked out from Boston, their towels tucked into their belts. Uncle Freddy made them a speech. My friends, he shouted, Walden is as sacred as the Ganges. It is a gem of the first water, which Concord wears in her coronet. Edward and Eleanor were terribly embarrassed, and they tugged at Uncle Freddy. But he wouldn't stop. The boys nudged one another and began to run. Uncle Freddy pulled away from Edward and sprinted along the center of the road. Cars full of bathers honked at him, and their drivers leaned out to shout. But Uncle Freddy neither saw nor heard. The boys he had been chasing soon outdistanced him. He didn't care. He was returning at last to Henry's Walden, that quiet pond where one man had sought a refuge from village life and had stayed to be self-appointed inspector of snowstorms and rainstorms, and to hear with his own ears what was written on the wind. Suddenly, Uncle Freddy veered his course and plunged into the woods. Edward and Eleanor were glad to leave the main road. They followed him clumsily as he danced along the woodland path. Henry's house should be right in here somewhere, he said. They came upon several other people. A tall young man who had his arm around a girl, and an old man sleeping with a newspaper over his face. So many to pay their respects to Henry today, rejoiced Uncle Freddy. Then, all at once, they came to a cleared area. There was a pile of stones there, and a square of ground marked off with chains. There were more stones half buried in the ground. One of them had an inscription. Edward read it aloud. Beneath these stones lies the chimney foundation of Thoreau's cabin, 1845 to 1847. Eleanor looked at Uncle Freddy. What would he say? Uncle Freddy stared at the stone. Then he bent over it and read it to himself. Well, he said, he's not at home. He stood up shakily. I'll call another day, he said. Then Uncle Freddy shambled off, blinking and wandered sadly along the shore of the pond. Eleanor suddenly felt overcome by the melancholy of the late summer day in the dusty, untidy woods. She sat down on one of the chains and pushed herself idly back and forth. Edward looked doubtfully at the pile of stones. It was almost as high as he was. If there were any Brazilian diamonds and pearls from Coromandel anywhere here, they were buried under the stones. Tentatively, he toyed with his spade. Where should they start? Should they move all those stones? They were aroused by a shout from Uncle Freddy. For a foolish moment, they wondered if he had found the treasure. They stumbled down the path to the shore and ran along the edge of the water, looking for him. They found him staring at the opposite side of the pond, where the public bathing beach was, and waved his arms. It had finally dawned on Uncle Freddy that the swarms of bathers there had not come to Walden to pay their respects to Henry Thoreau. "Who dares to defile this gem in Concord's crown?" he cried. Then he was off again, running around the shore to the beach, ranting and shouting and waving his hat. Eleanor and Edward lunged after him. Oh, why had they come? The spades bounced uncomfortably on Eddie's shoulder, and Eleanor suddenly felt absurd with the big Gladstone bag. To think they had expected to fill its bulging old sides with pearls. "Oh, Uncle Freddy," cried Eleanor, "please stop and let's go home." But Uncle Freddy wouldn't stop. He was romping ankle-deep in the water now, soaking his shoes and his baggy knickers to their knees. He shouted at the bathers and made so much noise that he almost drowned out the happy screams of small boys jumping off the dock. He scooped up some water with his hands and splashed it at an elderly lady bather, who fell back in the water and had to be rescued by her husband. The husband turned out to be Mr. Preek, looking astonishingly in a voluminous striped suit. Looking astonishing in a voluminous striped suit. Furious, Mr. Preek started splashing Uncle Freddy back. There was a violent whitewater battle. Uncle Freddy was soon wet all over. But he seemed to exult in being drenched. "Tell me, brother, what are we?" he bellowed at Mr. Preek. "Spirits bathing in the sea of deity?" Then, suddenly, he abandoned that encounter and waded sloppily to the dock. He climbed on and charged along it, leaping nimbly over prostrate always get those two confused. Prostrate sunbathers. He galloped right to the deep end and plunged off it head first. He was aiming a watery attack on an old fellow who was floating peacefully along in a rubber inner tube. "He'll drown!" cried Eleanor desperately. She ran after him, but he was caught in a milling tide of curious bathers. She slipped on the wet dock and was almost trampled on. Edward burrowed beneath them and was just in time to see Uncle Freddy being hauled out by an angry lifeguard. As soon as he was back on his feet, wheezing and blowing, Uncle Freddy slipped loose and took off again. He rushed at the crowd, clapping his hands, the water in his knickers ballooning them out around his knees. "Get along," he cried. "Get along home." He chased a shrieking, laughing band of hulking boys and girls off the dock. Then they ambushed him and counterattacked with towels and huge striped rubber balls. An inner tube ringed Uncle Freddy neatly, pinning his arms to his side. He sprinted away, struggling with it. They chased him all the way up the steep concrete steps to the street, the brawny lifeguard in the lead, and Mr. Preek gasping in the rear. Edward and Eleanor, abandoning their possessions, chased him too. What, oh, what would Aunt Lily say? Astonishingly, Uncle Freddy stayed out in front. He surged past the trailer park and put on speed. His pursuers would never have caught him at all if he hadn't suddenly swerved and rushed at a hot dog stand, and that thrown himself at the wavy surface of a comic mirror that was fastened to the outside. His own distorted image had become the enemy. "The grease spot!" he howled, with chattering teeth, recoiling and hurling himself at it again. "Horny-handed harpy on the shore of Icarian Sea!" The lifeguard got to him first and handled him roughly. Then the crowd of laughing bathers and Mr. Preek, and then at last the police. They had been summoned by the hot dog man, who didn't understand enough of Uncle Freddy's remarks to be insulted, but recognized an escaping lunatic when he saw one. Edward and Eleanor caught up just in time to see Uncle Freddy bundled into a car, handcuffed to a policeman. They struggled home, climbed sobbing up the steps, and broke the news to Aunt Lily. She clasped her hands. "It was my fault," she said. "I should never have let him go." She bustled around for clean, warm clothes for Uncle Freddy. Then she climbed into her car and drove with a grim courage to the town hall. Uncle Freddy had been taken there and thrust dripping behind bars. Aunt Lily talked sensibly to the police chief, and he finally agreed to discharge Uncle Freddy in her care. But they had a hard time getting him to leave his cell. He wanted to stay, and he hung on to the bars with all his might. "Henry spent a whole night in jail, and so will I." But finally, with a gentle talk and soft words, Aunt Lily persuaded him to come home. Mr. Preek came along with a piece of paper for Aunt Lily to sign. It said that Uncle Freddy should be locked up in an asylum where he couldn't do any harm or come to any. But Aunt Lily burst into tears and refused to sign it. Mr. Preek left with harsh words. Edward and Eleanor, thoroughly exhausted, went to bed early. They were almost too tired to climb the 3 sets of stairs to the tower room. Eleanor, lying in bed and drifting off to sleep, thought once again about the diamonds and the pearls. Were the jewels really buried at Walden? And if so, where? Should they dig under the pile of stones or elsewhere? Drowsily, she imagined them hiring a ship and sailing to Brazil, or floating lazily in an inner tube all the way to Coromandel, wherever that may be. I decided that trying to eat and read was probably not a good thing. So since we're at the next chapter, Pearls from Coromandel, Diamonds from Brazil. Here's the picture. Hopefully you can see that. I can't see the screen. Piece of Psycho chocolate. You're right, Kaylee. It's delicious. I really like it. A little bit of heat, not very much at all. But it's got chewy bits. Very tasty. I will finish the rest of it at the end. Pearls from Coromandel, Diamonds from Brazil. Eleanor felt small, terribly small, much smaller than she had ever felt before. Her small heart was beating at a great speed. She was furry. Her arms were crouched under her, and they had a new kind of wiry, tiny strength. Her ears felt strangely different and huge, and alive to different sorts of whisperings and cracklings and rustlings. At the end of her nose was a strange sensation, a kind of trembling awareness. She reached up a hand and felt at her nose. The fingers of her hand wouldn't separate. They were attached together and folded into a smooth little paw. But they could feel long vibrating hairs fanning out into whiskers. Behind her was another strange thing, a sense of sensitive support at her rear, a long, agile prop. A tail. She was a mouse. Her whisker ends brushed something nearby. It felt warm and friendly and furry. Eleanor crowded closer and snuggled against it, fur against fur. It was another mouse. "Hello," said Edward. "Isn't this nice?" "Where are we?" said Eleanor, looking up. Her eyes felt big and beady and sharp. Her nose quivered and wrinkled. There was a new kind of cleverness in her five senses, and another kind of sixth sense that seemed instinct in every smooth hair of her coat, and all down the bare length of her tail to the very tip. We have a visitor. You met Sashi. This is Abigail. She's sometimes a little grumpy. I don't want her laying and melting my chocolate, though. I don't think she'll get into it. Pardon me. Let's see. There was a new kind of cleverness in her five senses, and another kind of sixth sense that seemed instinct in her every smooth hair of her coat, and all down the bare length of her tail to the very tip. "I think this is a nest," said Edward. "I think it's our nest," said Eleanor. Through a hole in the top of the nest she could see the night sky. She made a sudden movement and found herself looking out of the hole. Eddie soaked his way up beside her. It was wonderful to move like a mouse. Together they looked out. Their nest lay in the forked branch of an alder that stood among other alders at the edge of a body of water. Is it the ocean?" said Eleanor. Edward studied it for a minute. "No," he said. "It's Walden Pond. Come on, I want to feel like what it's I want to feel what it's like to run with 4 feet." The two mice crept out of their nest, their heads cocked and alert. Then swiftly they ran down to the ground and darted into into the leafy cover of the shore. Running on 4 feet, Edward decided joyfully, was more like roller skating than anything else. His 4 legs worked rhythmically and knowingly under him, with 1,000 rapid patterings, and the rest of him was carried along smoothly, without the bumps and jogs and sharp recoil that lumbering humans' feet make when they hit the hard ground. He wanted to try it some more. "Let's go," he said. He poked his nose out from under the enormous umbrella of a dried oak leaf, and then scurried forth on his roller skate feet again. Eleanor followed, with a few nervous half-starts. Why did it seem so natural to cower under the leaf and to rush so quickly from one corner to the next? Timidly, she darted after Eddie, who was scrambling happily from one great pebble along the shore to another. "Come on," she said. "Let's look for Ned and Nora." Eddie pattered on ahead. "Where do you think we should look?" he said, poking his nose this way and that under the growth along the shore. He was trying to find a clear lane along which he could try to get up some real speed. At last he found what he was looking for. Under the tree-like growth of the blueberry bushes and the sumac, there was a little Under the tree-like growth of the blueberry bushes and the sumac, there were little branching paths, miniature little highways along which he could scuttle at breakneck speed, his reluctant mouse sister hurrying after him. Intersecting with these tiny hidden byways were broader avenues. Whose thoroughfares were these? They soon found out. "Look out!" warned Eleanor, nipping Edward's tail. Her teeth were wonderfully sharp, and Edward was hurt so badly he leapt sideways. But he was just in time to be out of the way of the vast hairy body that came lumbering down the right-of-way. The two mice cowered under a clump of fern that was like a forest of palm trees, and watched it go by. It was a raccoon, padding on his 4 black hands along the path, on the way to the water's edge, to paddle in the shallows. "Let's just stay here and watch the world go by," said Eleanor. They made themselves comfortable between the bristling stumps of long dead ferns and looked out with their bright black eyes. Their mouse hearts fluttered, and their marvelous ears cocked this way and that, picking up earsful of newts. They heard a loon's weird cry in the water, now near, now far away. Something in Eleanor's velvet hide told her she was safe. She leaned against Edward, enjoying his brotherly warmth and savoring the sense of being nothing at all, a part of the night and of the woods and nothing more. There was a goose honking over the pond, and high above them in the top of a hickory tree, the sound of a wood thrush singing. "Listen, listen," said Edward. Then there was another sound. Edward and Eleanor were aware of it at the same instant and cocked their ears towards it. It was a deep, earth-shaking double thud. There was nothing animal-like or bird-like about it. It was a solid, rhythmical, steady boom, boom, as of a great weight driving into the ground. It approached and grew stronger. Then it cast a giant shadow across the moon, and the two little mice looked up and up. It was a man. He was walking along the forest path, his knees brushing against the blueberry bushes, his boots treading softly, heel toe, but carrying such height and weight in them that they would send solid vibrations into the ground. "Let's follow him," said Eddie. They crept out of the projection of the clump of fern and ran after him in little rushes to this side and that. Where was he going? He was going home, and home was a little house in the middle of the woods, growing up like something as natural to the woods as the pitched pines, creaking its shingles. The thudding stopped. The towering man stood still. He was reaching into his pocket. Then he stooped and sprinkled something on the ground. Edward and Eleanor stopped in their tracks and watched, but the man didn't look at them. Instead, he got up again to his full height and disappeared again against the blackness of the house. They could hear his door open and shut, and a moment later they could see light shining through the small panes of glass in the window. He was gone. Edward discovered at the end of his wrinkling nose a tremendous curiosity. What had the man scattered on the ground? He moved cautiously forward, his nose leading the way surely and certainly. Ah, here it is. He had found a large bread crumb. He gobbled it and then found another and took it back to Eleanor. She had never seen anything that looked or smelled so delicious. She sat up on her hind legs, held the bread crumb between her front paws, and ate it delicately. She wanted another. Edward was already out again, foraging. He came back. "Come on," he said. "Get your own. There's hundreds of them." He put them there just for us. Eleanor ran her tongue across her mouth chops. Never in her girl life had she tasted anything so good as that breadcrumb. But the clearing where the crumbs were scattered was empty of cover. Eleanor peered out into the moonlight, sought out a single tempting breadcrumb, scampered out after it, picked it up with her teeth, and hurried back. Then she reared up comfortably again and ate it between her paws. Goodness, but it was satisfying. It tasted like more, and the more tasted like still more. Eleanor picked up one crumb at a time, then two. Edward was simply wandering from crumb to tempting crumb. Just one more, he kept saying to himself. Then he would run back to the leaves. There was a particularly delicious-looking piece of crust over there. He started for it, but Eleanor was there first. She bit deeply into it and started to eat it then and there. Edward batted at her with his paw. "I saw it first," he said. "Finders keepers," squeaked Eleanor sharply. She gnawed daintily away. Edward angrily sank his long teeth into the other end of the crust and tugged. For a moment the two of them jerked feverishly at it, glaring into each other's eyes. They were so enraged with one another that they paid no attention to a new sound, a soft, rushing whirling overhead. All at once the bread gave way, and Eleanor fell over, every hair on her body stood on end. "Beware!" cried her sixth sense. There was a huge dark shape above her, grasping and grasping. If the bread hadn't broken, the shape would have had her. She leapt to her feet and darted this way and that way, in tacking fits and starts. The shadow disappeared, then fell on her again. It missed, then it lifted and hovered over her. Eleanor skittered frantically from side to side. Her rapid mouse heart beat accelerated to a terrible staccato thumping. But suddenly Eddie was ahead of her, running. He squeaked at her, "To the house! Hole in the cellar!" Then he spurted away, leading the great looming, flopping, grasping shadow after him. Eleanor made a dash for the house, scrambled over stones of the foundation, found a chunk between them, and tumbled in. Then she scrabbled back to the hole and looked out. It was an owl, an ordinary New England screech owl. Eddie was running spasmodically in short left, right, left dashes in front of it. But each dash was a little shorter, and with each one the owl missed him by less and less of a hair's breadth. They they were coming this way. Could he reach the side of the house and safety? "Come on, Eddie," squealed Eleanor. He was almost there, but the owl was there first. It flopped between Eddie and the house. Eddie stopped short. The great owl eyes glowed at him. Hypnotized, Eddie stared back. It was a very odd, but it was true. He recognized the owl. The face of the bird of prey, with its shadow eyes and hooked beak, was one he had seen before. Wasn't it the same as... But the owl was lifting its talons to plunge at him. Then Eleanor helped. With a mighty shove, with all her miniature strength, she dislodged a loose pebble from the side of the hole in the wall. It fell on the owl's back, and the bird flapped a few feet in the air with a disconcerted screech. Not far, but just far enough for Eddie to see his chance and take it. Breathlessly, just ahead of the owl's claws, he tumbled into the dark opening into the wall and lay panting on his side on the floor. Eleanor huddled against him and waited. She could feel Eddie's sides heaving up and down. After a while, the heaving stopped, but he lay still a moment longer. At last, he was recovered enough to stand up on his 4 feet. They were ready to look about them, and ready to listen to something besides the hammering of their own hearts. Why, there was music! From far ahead, floating down through the cracks of the floorboards, there came a thin, reedy fluting. The notes wandered mournfully up and down. They made no recognizable melody. They sounded more like the natural music of the loon or the wood thrush out of doors than any man-made music. Edward and Eleanor had to see for themselves. They ran up a pile of sacks, smoothly rounded with grain, and they found a knothole in one of the floorboards. They squeezed through it and scuttled across the floor of the lighted room to a hiding place beneath the hearth. From there they could look out and observe the man. He sat turned away from them at a small table, leaning his chair back on its 2 rear legs. He was blowing on a wooden flute. The haunting music charmed them. They had but one thought, to see his face. Carefully, they crept out of their hiding place and moved noiselessly around the wall to the other side of the small room. From here they could see only the thick trousers and heavy boots. Then the music stopped, and the chair tipped forward onto all 4 legs. The flute was put down. There was a rustling of paper, and there began a strange scratching noise. What was he doing? The 2 mice simply had to know. Softly, they ran up one of the rear legs of his table and hid behind a pair of books that lay on its top. From there, they could peer out cautiously at him. The scratching sound came from his pen. He was writing. "It's Henry," whispered Eleanor. It was Henry indeed. He was homelier than the sculpture Henry that stood in the parlor at home. His face had a kind of sun-browned strength. He was looking down at the page across, with his pen, which his pen was moving so surely. Edward's beady eyes looked down at it too, and there he saw something extraordinary. "Oh, Eleanor, look!" he said, pointing at it with his paw. Then she saw it too. Out of Henry's scratching pen, a series of shining blots was flowing. They were jewels. They lay upon the paper like sentences of pearls, whole paragraphs and pages of glittering diamonds. It was the treasure they had been seeking, the pearls from Coromandel, the diamonds from Brazil. And having found the treasure, Eleanor and Edward came to the end of their dream, and burrowed their way back into consciousness in a real world of the morning. They woke up together and sat up in their beds. Someone was calling. It was Aunt Lily, hallooing up the attic stairs. "Hurry up, children," she was saying. "It's the first day of school." Edward got up, feeling unpleasantly pink and smooth without his mousy fur, and clumsily giantesque. I'm sorry. Edward got up first, feeling unpleasantly pink and smooth without his mousy fur, and clumsily gigantesque. He rubbed the places where his whiskers had been. "No more roller skating," he said sadly. Eleanor was leaning up on one elbow, thinking. The treasure was in the book he was writing. What book was it? "It was Walden," said Eddie promptly. "He lived at Walden Pond and kept a journal. And then he wrote it all over again later and called the book Walden. Not for nothing was Edward the nephew of Uncle Freddy. I'll bet we'll find the jewels in the book, with the pages pasted together and the inside hollowed out like a box." He ran to the bookcase. "Aha!" he said. "Here it is." He pulled out a book and flopped it open. How disappointing. The pages all rifled separately apart. There was nothing on them or in them but black print. Disgusted, Eddie threw the book on the floor. Eleanor got up and squatted down beside it. She picked it up and looked at the outside. It was Walden, all right, by Henry David Thoreau. She opened it, and the book fell open at the fly-leaf. And here Eleanor found the jewels. Written were these words in a familiar script. To Ned and Nora, here are Henry's jewels, his Walden, a treasure for the world beyond price. I hope when you are grown up you will read it and see that its words are what Henry hoped they were. Pearls from Coromandel and diamonds from Brazil. From your affectionate friend, Krishna. Now, wasn't that just like a grown-up? The treasure was a book. The diamonds and pearls were just words anybody could have for the reading. Edward grabbed the book. He meant to throw it at the wall, then something made him stop. He looked at it, then put it carefully back in the bookcase. He put on his bathrobe and went whistling down the ladder steps. "Someday I'll have to read it," he said, as his head disappeared below the trapdoor. Eleanor watched the top of his head go down. Then she remembered something and shuddered. Part of the dream had been a nightmare. They might have been killed, and the treasure had hardly been worth that danger. Would all the others be like that? An old music box, a broken doll, an old book? Surely some of the others would be exchangeable for cold, hard cash. And that is the end of the chapter. The next chapter, a sneak peek, spoilers, is Mirror, Mirror on the Wall. You see Edward and Eleanor out looking at the gazing ball. But 2 chapters and 40 minutes is a good place to stop, except that I still have a good bit of chili bar left. So I'm going to have a piece or two of that. See if anyone wants to chat. It really is good. I could joyfully have that. Psycho Chili. Psycho Chocolate. The Naga Jolokia is actually one of my favorite of the super hot peppers. I'd probably say it is my favorite. This has a slight smoky taste to it. It's not too sweet. The salt has a little bit of crunch. It's good. The next chapter I will probably read probably Sunday night. Hope you are enjoying this, and I hope you'll join me again then to find out what more treasures there are. And until then, like and subscribe if you liked it. Subscribe and hit the bell if you want to be notified when I'm going live again. And until then, I'll see you. Bye-bye.